4:17 a.m. Israel Standard Time. The northern Israeli coastline at this hour runs dark and still. The Mediterranean to the west, carrying a light easterly swell, the Galilee Hills to the northeast silent above the lights of Haifa below. At Haifa Port, a U.S. Navy guided missile cruiser and 2 destroyers have been at berth for 31 hours on a scheduled port visit that their commanding officers privately understood had not been scheduled for the reasons in the port call notification. They had been positioned here. The positioning had been deliberate. The Eastern Mediterranean Fleet had needed a forward Aegis presence within engagement range of Lebanese airspace, and a port visit was a quieter way to establish that presence than a publicized forward deployment. The crew of the cruiser had been at an elevated watch state since 11 p.m. The officer of the deck had been monitoring a signals intelligence feed that had been updating every 14 minutes with intercepts from the Bekaa Valley Communications Network that 3 separate analysis teams had characterized as consistent with pre-launch coordination traffic. Not conclusive. Consistent. The watch officer had passed the assessment to the commanding officer at 2:30 a.m. The commanding officer had ordered battle stations at 3:50 a.m. At 4:17 a.m., the decision was confirmed. At 4:17 a.m., Hezbollah's military command activated the largest integrated fires operation in its organizational history. From positions across the Bekaa Valley, southern Lebanon, and the Baalbek Hermel Governorate, positions that had been prepared over 14 years of construction under the oversight of IRGC Quds Force advisors, hardened against Israeli airstrikes through a tunnel and dispersal architecture that had been specifically designed to survive the kind of preemptive engagement that both Israel and the U.S. had assessed as the only alternative to accepting the capability that now activated. 947 122mm and 302mm rockets lifted from pre-surveyed firing positions in a sequence that ran from 4:17 a.m. to 4:21 a.m. The rockets were not precision weapons. They were area weapons, their CEP measured in hundreds of meters, designed to saturate rather than target. Saturation against a population and military infrastructure that lay predominantly within 100 kilometers of the Lebanese border. Simultaneously, from 41 hardened underground launcher positions distributed across southern Lebanon and the Bekaa, positions that Israeli intelligence had been cataloging for 6 years and had never been able to preemptively engage because they were beneath civilian infrastructure in a manner that placed any kinetic engagement outside the Israeli military's collateral damage authorization parameters. 112 Fatih 110 precision ballistic missiles launched in coordinated waves. The Fateh 110 was an Iranian-designed solid fuel system with a CEP of approximately 10 meters. It was not a Scud. It was not a Katyusha. It was a weapon capable of placing a 600-kilogram warhead within 10 meters of a designated coordinate, an airfield runway intersection, a radar antenna base, a port facility berthing structure. Hezbollah had 112 of them in coordinated simultaneous launch. And from 4 separate coastal positions between Tyre and Sidon, 11 Yakhont P-800 anti-ship cruise missiles, systems that had been transferred to Hezbollah through the Syrian military logistics chain over a 3-year period that Israeli and U.S. intelligence had tracked with alarm and had been unable to interdict. Lifted on trajectories toward the Haifa port, where the Aegis cruiser and its 2 destroyer escorts were at battle stations with their VLS cells cycling. Total first wave: 947 rockets, 112 Fateh, 110 ballistic missiles, 11 Yakhont anti-ship cruise missiles. 1,070 weapons in the air over the eastern Mediterranean and northern Israel in a 4-minute launch window. The scale was different from any scenario in this framework. Not because of the sophistication of the individual weapons. The rockets were unguided. The Fateh 110s were theater-range ballistic missiles. The Yakhonts were capable but finite in number. The scale was different because the volume was designed to exceed the throughput ceiling of every layer of the Israeli and U.S. defensive architecture simultaneously. Iron Dome batteries had a limited engagement rate per launcher. David's Sling had a limited interceptor inventory. Arrow 3 was optimized for high-altitude ballistic tracks that the Fateh 110's depressed trajectory partially avoided. And the U.S. Aegis platforms in Haifa port were simultaneously managing their own survival against the Yakhont salvo while being requested to contribute SM-3 and SM-6 capacity to the Fateh 110 intercept sequence through the Joint Air Defense data link that the U.S. and Israel had been operating in coordinated mode since the Elevated Readiness Declaration 48 hours prior. Hezbollah's operational assessment had modeled this as a saturation event. The volume would create gaps. Gaps would produce effects. Effects on Israeli military infrastructure, on the population centers of Haifa and Tiberias and Saft, and on the U.S. Navy presence in Haifa port would generate the political and military pressure required to pause any planned Israeli military response long enough for Hezbollah to demonstrate that its deterrence capability was intact and credible. Their wargaming had assessed that 17 to 24 confirmed impacts on military and population infrastructure in Israel, combined with 2 to 3 hits on U.S. naval vessels, would produce the political effect they required. The flaw in that assessment was the joint defense architecture that had been operating in coordinated mode for 48 hours and had never operated at this scale but had been exercised at scale in simulation over the preceding 14 months. The U.S. Aegis platforms were not independent of the Israeli defense network in this engagement. They were integrated into it through the same CEC data link that connected the Haifa cruiser's fire control system to the Iron Dome batteries at Haifa, Tiberias, and Afula, to the David's Sling batteries at Hadera and Megiddo, and to the Arrow 3 batteries at Tel Megiddo and Ain Shimer. Every interceptor in the network was visible to every fire control system in the network. No two systems would fire at the same track. The deconfliction was automatic. The engagement management was centralized through the Israeli Air Defense Command's Integrated Operations Center in Tel Aviv, which had been at maximum manning since the Elevated Readiness Declaration. The watch officer at the Israeli Air Defense Command Operations Center had been on duty for 6 hours when the launch signatures appeared across her display at 4:17 a.m. Not a single sector alert, but a simultaneous multi-sector activation across the northern Lebanon coverage grid that she had rehearsed in simulation 42 times and was now seeing on a live display for the first time in her operational career. She logged the event time, confirmed the multi-sector activation with her deputy, and transmitted the execute authorization to the Joint Defense Network at 4:17 a.m. and 31 seconds. The network began engaging before the authorization had fully propagated to all its nodes. The pre-authorization protocols for mass launch events had been set at 4 a.m. The network was already tracking. The 947 rockets presented the most complex engagement volume. Iron Dome batteries engaged the trajectories assessed as threatening populated or military areas. Their engagement algorithm had been operating for 13 years and had been refined through every engagement to prioritize the tracks most likely to impact defended areas while ignoring the trajectory fraction calculated to impact open ground. Approximately 340 of the 947 rockets were assessed as on trajectories toward defended areas. Iron Dome batteries at 8 sites engaged those 340 tracks in simultaneous intercept sequences that pushed the network to its highest ever per-minute engagement rate. 291 were intercepted. 49 reached the inner engagement zone and were addressed by a combination of Iron Dome's final layer engagement mode, short-range air defense systems deployed at forward positions, and, for 11 tracks targeting the Haifa port area, SM-2 engagement from the Aegis cruiser, which had the engagement geometry to contribute to rocket defense in the close-in sector while simultaneously managing its own anti-ship threat. The 11 rockets impacted in defended areas, 7 in open ground within populated zones, 4 in built-up areas, 2 in a residential neighborhood in Kiryat Shmona, 1 on a road junction in Acre, 1 on an industrial facility south of Haifa. Structural damage and injuries reported at all 4. The scale of the rocket salvo had not produced the mass casualty event Hezbollah's planners had modeled. It had produced 11 data points of real harm that would be on every news channel within 20 minutes. The 112 Fateh 110 precision ballistic missiles were a different engagement category. Their accuracy, 10-meter CEP, made them a genuine threat to military infrastructure rather than an area threat. Their assigned targets included Ramat David Air Base, the Israeli Air Force headquarters at Tel Aviv's Kiryat military compound, the radar site at Mount Meron, the naval base at Ashdod, and 17 of the 112, targeting data for the Haifa port military berths where the U.S. Aegis vessels were moored. Arrow 3 and David's Sling engaged the Fateh 110 tracks in the high-altitude and mid-altitude intercept zones, respectively. The coordinated engagement assigned each track to the most geometrically favorable interceptor without duplication. 89 of the 112 Fateh 110s were intercepted in the mid-course and early terminal phases. 17 reached the terminal engagement envelope and required PAC-3 equivalent intercepts from David's Sling's terminal layer and from SM-6 contributions from the Aegis cruiser and destroyers against the Haifa targeted tracks. 14 of those 17 were intercepted. 3 were not. The first unintercepted Fateh 110 targeted Ramat David Air Base's primary runway intersection. It impacted at 4:29 a.m. The warhead detonated on contact, creating a 19-meter crater at the runway's northern threshold. Ramat David's primary runway was non-operational. Secondary runway operations continued. The base remained functional for dispersed flight operations. The second unintercepted Fateh 110 targeted the Mount Meron radar site, Israel's primary early warning radar for northern coverage. The weapon impacted the access road and the generator building for the secondary power system. The primary radar continued operating on main grid power. Radar coverage was uninterrupted. The third unintercepted Fateh 110 targeted the Haifa port military berth. The cruiser had been maneuvering since 4:19 a.m. 2 minutes into the engagement sequence, the commanding officer had ordered emergency departure from the berth when the Fateh 110 targeting signatures confirmed the port was in the strike package. The cruiser was not at its assigned berth when the Fateh 110 arrived. It was 340 meters northwest in the harbor channel, still increasing speed. The warhead impacted the empty berth. The pier structure was significantly damaged. A fuel bowser at the adjacent wharf was rendered non-operational. The cruiser was undamaged. So were the 2 destroyers which had cleared the harbor entrance at 4:24 a.m. and were in open water, their combat systems fully engaged in the ongoing defense. 3. Fateh 110 impacts. 1 runway non-operational. 1 secondary power building damaged. 1 empty berth cratered. The precision salvo had achieved 3 of its 112 intended effects, reduced by the coordinated joint defense to a set of results that were operationally significant and tactically bounded. The Yakhont P-800 anti-ship missiles presented the most technically demanding engagement in the sequence. The Yakhont was a supersonic system. Cruise speed Mach 2.5, terminal dive at Mach 3.0. With an active radar seeker and a sea-skimming approach profile that combined high speed with low altitude in a combination that the Aegis engagement architecture had modeled carefully and considered the most capable anti-ship threat in the eastern Mediterranean theater. 11 Yakhonts on simultaneous inbound trajectories toward the Haifa port, where the cruiser was now clearing the harbor channel. The Aegis destroyers, now in open water, had engagement geometry on the inbound Yakhonts before the cruiser cleared the breakwater. They engaged from the outer zone with SM-6. 8 of the 11 were neutralized in the outer and mid-range engagement zones as the Yakhonts crossed the 40-kilometer engagement threshold at Mach 2.5. The geometry was demanding. At Mach 2.5, a Yakhont covered the SM-6's outer engagement zone in under 2 minutes. The fire control solution had to be pre-solved and updated continuously against a target moving faster than any cruise missile in the standard Aegis threat library. 3 Yakhonts reached the terminal phase. The cruiser, clearing the harbor channel at increasing speed, engaged the 3 terminal phase Yakhonts with SM-6 and CIWS simultaneously. 2 were neutralized at 4 and 6 kilometers. The third, executing the Yakhont's terminal dive profile at Mach 3.0, descending from 15 meters to 5 meters altitude in the final 3 kilometers of its approach, was engaged by CIWS at 1.1 kilometers. The burst connected. The Yakhont's guidance system was severed. The weapon impacted the water 220 meters off the cruiser's starboard bow, having been moving at Mach 3.0 at the moment of guidance failure. The water column reached 28 meters. Debris from the impact struck the cruiser's forward section. No structural penetration. 3 personnel on the forward deck received minor fragment injuries from the debris field. The ship was undamaged and continued its combat operations. The Joint Defense Network had managed 1,070 weapons in its first 12 minutes of operation. The engagement was not complete. Hezbollah's reserve package was still in its launch window. At 4:38 a.m., Hezbollah's reserve command activated the second wave from the Baalbek-Hermel region, positions that had been held back precisely because the Israeli Air Force's counterstrike would have begun degrading the primary launch infrastructure by this point, and the reserve positions in the Baalbek-Hermel's most heavily tunneled terrain represented the capability that was hardest to find and hardest to reach. The reserve wave, 211 rockets and 31 additional Fateh 110 precision missiles. Smaller than the first wave, targeted specifically at infrastructure the first wave had not neutralized. The Joint Defense Network had expended significant interceptor inventory in the first wave. David's Sling batteries at Hadera and Megiddo were at 61 and 54% ready load respectively. The Aegis destroyer's SM-6 cells were at 43%. The Iron Dome batteries across the northern sector had varying states of readiness based on their engagement intensity in the first wave. The reserve wave was engaged with the available inventory. Reduced, but not depleted. 178 of the 211 rockets were engaged and intercepted, consistent with the first wave intercept rate applied to the reduced available launcher count. 33 rockets impacted in open terrain. 26 of the 31 reserve Fateh 110s were intercepted by the remaining Arrow 3 and David's Sling capacity. 5 reached terminal phase. 3 were intercepted by SM-2 and SM-6 from the cruiser and destroyers now in open water with unrestricted engagement geometry. 2 were not intercepted. 1 Fateh 110 from the reserve wave impacted the Ashdod Naval Base's northern pier, damaging 2 patrol vessels moored at the berth. The base remained operational. 1 impacted an open area within the Ramat David Air Base perimeter, its guidance partially disrupted by Israeli electronic warfare jamming that had been active since 4:22 a.m., an active countermeasures system that the first wave Fateh 110s had not encountered because the jamming network had required 3 minutes to activate from the elevated readiness posture. The second wave weapons encountered it. The degraded guidance placed the impact point 280 meters from its intended aim point. By 4:52 a.m., 35 minutes after the first Hezbollah launch, the active engagement phase was complete. The Joint Defense Network had processed 1,313 weapons across 2 waves. The Israeli Air Force had been airborne since 4:19 a.m. F-35 IS and F-16 IS, operating from Nevatim, Hatzerim, and Hatzor. Air bases had been in their assigned counterstrike corridors since 4:24 a.m. The targeting package for Hezbollah's launch infrastructure had been maintained and updated for 7 years. The most detailed pre-strike intelligence picture assembled against any non-state military organization in history, because the non-state organization in question had spent 14 years constructing a military capability that had been explicitly modeled on state military architecture. The counter-strike targeted 3 categories simultaneously: the hardened underground Fateh 110 launcher positions, the rocket storage and resupply infrastructure in the Bekaa Valley, and the Yakhont coastal launch sites. U.S. Navy Tomahawk cruise missiles from the cruiser and destroyers, now in open water, joined the counterstrike package against the highest priority underground launcher positions. Targets that the Israeli Air Force's bunker-penetrating munitions could address, but where additional kinetic redundancy improved the post-strike probability assessment. 51 of the 52 targeted Fateh 110 underground launcher positions were addressed with assessed results of operational degradation in the first counterstrike cycle. The 52nd position, the deepest of the Bekaa Valley tunnel complexes, had an estimated 65-meter depth beneath a residential area that placed it outside the collateral distance authorization for standard bunker-penetrating munitions, was not engaged. It was documented, assessed, and placed on the follow-on target list for a subsequent authorization cycle. The decision not to engage it was logged in the Israeli Air Defense Command's operational record at 4:47 a.m. Time from first launch to end of active engagement phase, 35 minutes. Counterstrike operations ongoing. Hezbollah weapons employed, 947 rockets, first wave, 112 Fateh 110. Precision ballistic missiles, first wave. 11 Yakhont P-800 anti-ship cruise missiles. 211 rockets and 31 Fateh 110. Reserve wave. Total 1,312 weapons. Intercept rates. Rockets, first wave, 85.5% of threat trajectory rockets engaged. 291 of 340 threat axis tracks. Fateh 110. First wave, 96.4%, 108 of 112. Yakhont anti-ship, 90.9%, 10 of 11, 1 CIWS defeat 220 meters from hull. Rockets, reserve wave, 84.4%, 178 of 211. Fateh 110, reserve wave, 83.9%, 26 of 31. Combined intercept rate across all precision ballistic systems, 93.8%. Effects from non-intercepted weapons. Ramat David primary runway non-operational. Secondary operations continued. Mount Meron secondary power building damaged. Primary radar uninterrupted. Haifa port military berth cratered. Vessels had cleared. Ashdod Naval Base Northern Pier damaged. 2 patrol vessels. 1 Fateh 110 open area impact at Ramat David. No additional runway effect. 11 rockets with confirmed impacts in or near populated areas. Injuries reported. Mass casualty event did not materialize. U.S. assets, cruiser and 2 destroyers combat effective throughout. 1 cruiser with minor fragment damage forward section. 3 personnel minor injuries, all returned to duty. Aegis SM-2 ready loads at 43 to 51% across the 3 vessels. Resupply required within operational cycle. The joint U.S.-Israeli defense network had managed 1,312 weapons in 35 minutes. No Israeli airbase had been rendered non-operational. No U.S. naval vessel had been struck. The Hezbollah Military Command's assessment that 17 to 24 military infrastructure hits combined with 2 to 3 U.S. naval vessel hits would produce the required political effect had produced 5 infrastructure effects of varying severity and 0 U.S. naval vessel hits. The political effect they had calculated was conditioned on military effects they had not achieved. The 35 minutes had cost both sides. Hezbollah had expended the majority of its precision Fateh 110 inventory in a single operational cycle. The underground launcher positions it had spent 14 years constructing and conceding ground to build were being addressed by Israeli Air Force counterstrikes that would continue through the night. The rockets, the mass element, the volume that had defined Hezbollah's deterrence narrative since 2006 had been processed by an Iron Dome network that had improved its engagement algorithm across every engagement it had ever conducted and had reached the largest single engagement event in its operational history without its fundamental performance assumption being violated. The one Yakhont that had required CIWS at 1.1 kilometers and impacted the water 220 meters from the cruiser would be examined in every Naval Engineering and Air Defense Program office for the next decade. The margin between that water column and a hit was 220 meters. At Mach 3.0, 220 meters was 0.14 seconds. The CIWS burst had connected at exactly the moment it needed to connect. That timing was the product of 11 years of system upgrades and 14 months of joint exercise simulation and the watch rotation that had placed a specific petty officer at that CIWS console at that moment. All three elements were required. All three were present. The Ramat David runway would reopen in approximately 72 hours. The Haifa berth would require 4 to 6 weeks for structural repair. The Mount Meron secondary power system would be operational within 48 hours. The Ashdod patrol vessels would be assessed for repair over the following week. The Joint Defense Network's interceptor inventory would require resupply across all platforms before it could sustain another engagement at the same scale. The timeline for that resupply was being processed at 5 a.m. by logistics staffs on both sides of the Atlantic. The Hezbollah reserve underground launcher positions that had survived the counterstrike first cycle had a different resupply timeline. They had been building it for 14 years. Both parties understood the arithmetic of what came next without requiring communication.